Good evening, everybody. I am thrilled that you are joining us. I want to introduce myself. My name is Mark West. I am the chapter director of Sierra Club San Diego, and I'm joined by Josh Sita, the chapter director of the San Gorgonio chapter, and also Moises from Sierra Club California. Together, we are thrilled to welcome you to the Sierra Talks, the future
Recording
of
in progress.
the. Thank you, Michael. Forgot about recording it. Thank you. Um, We're thrilled to welcome you to the Sierra Talks, the future of the Salton Sea. Thanks for joining us this Thursday, September 18th. Um, it, we want to make sure that we're going to share these resources and the recording. So if you haven't, please make sure you've registered. The Salton Sea is vital to our communities, from clean air and public health to local jobs, wildlife habitat, and climate resilience across the Imperial and Coachella valleys and beyond. Tonight, we are really lucky to be joined by Michael Cohen, Senior Fellow at Pacific Institute, bringing 27 years of on the ground experience and real actionable solutions. This event will be an interactive session. If you have a question, either drop it in the Zoom chat or raise your hand and we'll virtually call on you when I see that. So during the presentation, please feel free to give feedback, to answer those questions, to ask those questions. If something comes to you afterwards, Michael is going to share his email so you can follow up with him directly. So we want to make this as interactive as possible, and we are very excited about this. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Michael Cohen, Senior Fellow at the Pacific Institute. So, Mike, take it away.
So thanks very much, Mark, and appreciate you all showing up on a Thursday evening. I'm going to do an overview of the Salton Sea, but as Mark said, happy to entertain questions throughout. Hopefully not to get too deep into any particular topic, but if there are questions that we want to drill down more, I'm more than happy to explore that. So let's see if I can share my screen here.
I did make you a co-host, so you should be able to there, Michael.
And then the joy of Zoom is I can't always see what you guys see, but hopefully this will
Looks
work.
great.
And you guys are seeing the full presentation mode, not my.
Yep, we're seeing the full presentation mode right now, Mike.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to kick it off. So Michael Cohen, as Mark mentioned, here's my email, and it'll pop up again later on, talking about Salton Sea, and I'll give a little background, talk a little bit about the policy, how we got to where we are, and then some prospects for the future. So quickly, Pacific Institute, we're a nonprofit based in Oakland. I'm out near the headwaters up in Colorado, but have been working on Salton Sea issues for a long time. I initially got interested in the Salton Sea back in 1998. I was hired by the Institute to work on Colorado River issues, but back in 98, there was this proposal to divert water from the Colorado River Delta into the Salton Sea. And we thought, the Salton Sea's got plenty of water. There's almost none in the Delta. But then I realized there was very few people working on the Salton Sea. So started putting out some reports and getting involved in state activities and federal activities, and on it ever since. So here's just a quick recent Google image of the Salton Sea. I suspect many of you have been out there. It's not too far from San Diego, but sometimes a little other side of the mountains is out of mind. So a couple takeaways from this particular image, really focusing on the south end there, which is where the New River discharges water into the Salton Sea. And you can see this kind of dotted red line there. So when you Google Map Salton Sea, this dotted red line indicates what Google thinks is the Salton Sea. But you can see that there's three different shorelines there. So this first red arrow is where the Salton Sea was 10, 15 years ago. And in fact, there's a levee there because back in the 90s and 80s, the Salton Sea was rising. And the Imperial Irrigation District built levees to protect farmland. And then just a couple of years ago, this dotted line, which is the Google Map shoreline, shows where it was. And then here's where we are now. In fact, here's where we were back in May, but the Salton Sea has dropped another half foot or so just in the past 4 or 5 months. So I always like to frame the Salton Sea as why do we care? And there's a whole host of reasons why we should care about the Salton Sea, but one of them is just its spectacular resource. So it's California's largest lake, major stopover for birds on the Pacific
I
Flyway.
had a map.
But it's water in the desert, which is an unusual occurrence, and in this particular instance, creates this resource where California's dried up 95% or so of its wetlands, so there's not that many other places for the birds to go. So here's a couple of maps from the University of Redlands. They put out an atlas back in right around 2000, showing again this importance of the Salton Sea as a stopover on the Pacific Flyway. So quickly, my talk, I'll give a little background about the Salton Sea, talk about some of the policy challenges. The talk was framed about restoration efforts. I'm going to talk a little about what restoration means in the context of the Salton Sea, and then try to gaze into the crystal ball and talk a little bit about the future. So first thing to take away about the Salton Sea is that it's huge. Not as big as it used to be, of course. It's some 65 square miles smaller than it was just when the QSA was signed in 2003, but it's still roughly 300 square miles. But the Salton Sea has dropped, right? So it's about 14 feet lower, 14 and a half feet lower than it was when the QSA was signed. And I'll talk about the QSA a little bit more about when I talk about the policy changes, but really it's an institutional change in the broader context of climate change, which is forced this initial shrinking of the Salton Sea. Another important thing about the Salton Sea, takeaway, is how dynamic the system is. So the Salton Sea has been always changing. The Colorado River Delta in general is a very dynamic system. So when we talk about restoration, it's this kind of nebulous concept in the context of the Salton Sea, because it is this very dynamic system. And when we talk about restoration, often we're talking about fixing some particular point in time on this resource. Last point on this particular slide here is that the Salton Sea is a huge body of water, but it's incredibly shallow. So a few years ago, I did a calculation. If the Salton Sea were 100 yards long, like the length of a football field, it'd be about a third of an inch deep on average. Right? This is a very shallow body of water, and that's part of the reason that when the Salton Sea shrinks, you get so much of the lake bed exposed. So let's put this in context of the Colorado River Basin. The Colorado River, of course, is in the news quite a bit these days. Basins, an upper basin, lower basin. And on this left image from the Lincoln Institute, or the Babbitt Center at the Lincoln Institute, came out a couple of years ago, you can really see that it's at the very tail end of the Colorado River system. And part of what that means is that the salts and the selenium that the river picks up as it moves downhill tend to accumulate at the bottom of the system, which is the Colorado River Delta. And a lot of that's the Salton Sea, and because the Salton Sea is 240 plus feet below sea level, the water collects there and the water evaporates, but the salts, the selenium, and then all the materials, fertilizers, the pesticides from the surrounding farm fields also tend to accumulate and concentrate in the Salton Sea itself. In this image on the right, we see the Lake Cahuilla, which formed and disappeared as the river meandered. But you can see from this particular image that Lake Cahuilla was much, much larger than the Salton Sea, and at some point filled more or less to sea level. And then the river would meander again, because that's what rivers used to do, and then would discharge back to the Gulf of California, stranding Lake Cahuilla, which would eventually evaporate. And then again, these salts had accumulated over decades or centuries, left a very salty base, or a salty playa, this lake bed. And in fact, there were salt mining operations before the most recent incarnation of the Salton Sea formed back in 1905. I guess just a quick sideline on the formation of the Salton Sea. So in 1905, the river flooded again. And then they had dug some channels into Imperial Valley, because there was so much sediment in the system and in these canals, and the whole river changed course and flowed once again back into the Lake Cahuilla, or now the Salton Sea, for a good 2 years. So that's where the current Salton Sea was formed, and then it's been sustained by agricultural runoff since. Here's a different image, and I like the satellite image, partly because it shows the agriculture in the region. So on the north end by Palm Springs, and that you see the Coachella Valley, it's about 75,000 acres of irrigated agriculture. And then on the lower end, the south end, is the Imperial Valley. It's about 450,000 acres of intensely irrigated agriculture. And you can really see the green there against the stark white of the desert. And then south of the border, you can see a continuation of agriculture, but there's much less water in Mexico, which means that land is less intensely irrigated, so it's less green. But in some ways, this green here is what used to be wetlands. It used to be the Colorado River Delta as a whole. So there's stories about jaguars that used to run through the Delta and how much ecological productivity was down there. Now we replace that with agricultural productivity, but less biodiversity, aside from all the birds. And there's still tremendous biodiversity in the Delta as a whole, and particularly at the Salton Sea. But what's changed is the inflows. So this is just from the state management program. They put it out in an annual report. It's linked here, and what we've seen here is that just in the past 10 years or so, there's some 20% drop in inflows to the Salton Sea. And that's continuing to drop because, as I'll talk about in a second, there's pressure on the Colorado River, which means there's pressure on the Imperial Irrigation District to use less and less water. So we're seeing an acceleration of the decline in the elevation of the Salton Sea and in the amount of water flowing into the Salton Sea. And this is shown here. This is a graph from my recent report, just showing how as inflows decline, you see this decline in elevation of the Salton Sea, which exposes more and more lake bed, and then concentrates the salts and other materials in the Salton Sea itself. Here's an older image just showing the long-term change in elevation of the Salton Sea. You can see the Salton Sea filled from 1905 to 1907. That's the big spike on the left. And then as they moved the Colorado River back into its channel, the Salton Sea very quickly shrunk. But then as they started to irrigate more and more intensively, particularly in the Imperial Valley, the elevation of the Salton Sea rose and rose, and then peaked about 1995. And then started to decline slowly, and then more rapidly as the QSA, these water transfers from Imperial Irrigation District to San Diego and then to Metropolitan as well, continued, which means less water and the sea shrinking. And at the same time, this red line shows the increase in salinity. So very quickly, the Salton Sea, so the Colorado River is essentially fresh water, but then salinity quickly rose to about ocean salinity, which is about 35 grams per liter of salts. And then it was because the total volume of the Salton Sea increased, salinity was fairly stable until about 2000. Then it's really started to climb again. And then this kind of dotted line is what they were projecting salinity to rise. And in fact, that's more or less what we're seeing now. So this table, again, from my recent report, just shows the amount of land exposed at the Salton Sea relative to what it was when the QSA was signed. And the QSA is really this inflection point. So I'll return to that. But people often think about the Salton Sea, and there's this 60 square miles or so of lake bed exposed. But in fact, a lot of that has been covered up by air quality or dust suppression projects. But particularly of interest from a habitat perspective is that there's been a lot of emergent vegetation. So a lot of cattails and other wetland species have started to grow atop the playa, so 8,000 acres of these wetland species. Because as the shoreline recedes, these drains, the agricultural drains, extend to try to reach that shoreline that's draining downhill. And then plants are growing up and then consuming some of that water. So a lot of that water never makes it to the Salton Sea. So takeaway here is really that although there's some 60, 65 square miles less Salton Sea than there used to be. It's not 65 square miles of open playa. Mark.
Yeah. Quick question. So you see that you're pretty much saying this emergent vegetation is really starting to kind of take off a little bit. As the salinity rises, won't that start reducing that as well?
So this emergent vegetation is sustained by the agricultural drains, and the drain water is pretty brackish. So it's on the order of 2,500 to 3,000 milligrams salinity, right? Way too salty to drink, but still only about a tenth the salinity of the ocean. It's once it hits the Salton Sea, which is now around 80, 85 grams per liter. So
Okay.
20 times, 30 times as salty as this drain water. So the cattails are pretty happy with this brackish drain water, but they're certainly not living in the Salton Sea. And once that water moves into the Salton Sea, the quality of that water is unable to sustain any vegetation at all.
Great. Okay. Thanks.
So these two slides just show how rapidly the Salton Sea receded and how much of this playa, this lake bed, was exposed. So it's disturbing to me to see these images because here we are 17 years later. But back in 2007, Red Hill Bay was a pretty iconic spot in the Salton Sea. There was a lot of pictures taken there. There was a lot of dead trees that have been inundated when the Salton Sea rose back in the 80s and 90s. And then those snags provide a lot of habitat. There's a lot of pictures of cormorant nests up in those snags. But since 2008 or so, it's all been exposed. And then, of course, that means there's no habitat, particularly for the fish-eating birds that are out there. Here's a different look at the exposure. This is from about a year and a half ago. IID puts out these reports, and it just shows the amount of exposure. And then the green here on the shoreline is some of this vegetation. You can see particularly on the very south end, you can kind of track where the drains discharge, and that's where these wetlands have emerged. And then also on the north end, there's a lot of drains from the Coachella Valley Water District, and there's been a lot of wetlands emerging in response to that available water supply. Just quickly, so I've been talking about dust in these various Salton Sea reports for a number of years, and there's a lot of concerns about dust at the Salton Sea and the impacts on public health, particularly people living downwind of this exposed playa. The other key change here is as the Salton Sea has shrunk and salinity has really skyrocketed, is the loss of the fishery and the loss of a lot of the macroinvertebrates. So back in 1999, there was a huge biological inventory, and there was an estimated 100 million fish in the Salton Sea. In fact, the number of fish was so high that they needed to come up with a new metric to relate to discuss that amount of fish. And there was anecdotes that people would go around in boats, and in the wake, you would see fish coming up in the wake of the boats. The main fish since the, I think, 50s, 60s has been tilapia, which is a freshwater fish. And this freshwater fish is adapted over time to tolerate this incredible salinity. But in the past 10, 15 years or so, the salinity has really started to stress the tilapia. And just in the past couple of years, we're getting reports that there's no tilapia in the main parts of the Salton Sea at all. There is still some tilapia congregating where the three main tributaries, the New, the Alamo, and the Whitewater River in the north, discharge, but that's about it for the fish, which means that the fish-eating birds, the white pelicans, the brown pelicans, the cormorants, largely abandoned the Salton Sea. And also, as the Salton Sea shrunk, the roosting habitat and the breeding habitat that it provided for a lot of migratory birds disappeared. So there was something called Mullet Island, and there was a lot of cormorants nesting on Mullet Island. But then as the Salton Sea receded, a land bridge formed, coyotes, raccoons, and other terrestrial predators came across, and then the birds abandoned that breeding habitat. And then as the Salton Sea continues to shrink and becomes more and more salty, we're going to lose the water boatmen. There'll likely be some brief period where there's a lot of brine flies and brine shrimp, like we see out at Mono Lake. But it's possible that the rate of change there will rapidly exceed their ability to adapt. And after a few years, even it's likely that it'll be too salty even for them. So how do we get here? So this is a pretty dense slide. I think I'm just going to breeze through some of it, but it's the policy changes that have occurred that have driven these changes we're seeing at the Salton Sea. So on the left end of the graph, you can see that there's this kind of rising limb of the elevation of the Salton Sea. And what happened was there was a hurricane back in the 70s, and then the farmers in ID started to double and even triple crop, meaning that they would grow vegetables in the winter, they would grow a lot more alfalfa or other crops in the rest of the year. So there was more irrigation, which means more water is flowing into the Salton Sea, which means the elevation of the Salton Sea rose. But the problem was some of these farmers had their ground immediately adjacent to the Salton Sea, and as it rose, it started to flood some of that ground. So in the late 70s, early 80s, some of these farmers sued IID, saying they needed to protect them and address the elevation of the Salton Sea. Went to the State Water Board, which issued this decision 1600, finding that IID was unreasonably using water, which led to a number of years of negotiations. But then in the late 80s, an agreement was signed between the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, which, as you may know, serves these days some 19 million people on coastal Southern California, from Ventura down to the border with Mexico. So there was this agreement signed with Met between IID, and Met agreed to pay a set amount of money to conserve up to 100,000 acre feet or so of water each year. So Met invested this money in lining canals, for example. They did a bunch of measurements and determined how much water is being saved. And then that water went to Metropolitan to help shore up their water supply portfolio. Shortly thereafter, San Diego County, there was a big drought, of course, in the late 80s, early 90s. San Diego got shorted and thought, that's a good deal to the east. We want a part of that. And they started negotiating their own transfer. And that took a number of years, and it ultimately culminated in the signing of the quantification settlement agreement in 2003, in which there was essentially the same kind of deal, where San Diego agreed to pay for water, which was then used to increase efficiency within IID's service area. And in exchange, San Diego got 200,000 acre feet of water. And then they had to buy out the intervening parties, do the water rights system. So Met got another 50,000 acre feet. Coachella got another 50,000 acre feet. And this is probably too deep in the weeds, but a lot of water started moving out of the district. And in response, we started to see the elevation fall, which you can see on the right side of the deal. But as part of the signing of the QSA, IID knew that there was going to be this ecological impacts, adverse ecological impacts, as well as adverse public health impacts because of the exposure. And IID didn't want the liability, and that was the stumbling block. So in the waning days of the Gray Davis administration, the governor at the time said, we need to do something about this. And I think he was trying to avoid a recall, said that they would sign a deal that would cap the total amount of liability, financial liability, for the QSA parties. And the state of California would assume responsibility over that amount. So it was $133 million in 2003 was the cap, and the state of California assumed liability for costs above that amount. And ultimately that led to the state's actions now, because the state is finding that it has a responsibility to pay for these mitigation projects at the Salton Sea, and that's what they're doing. So 2014, the state had this obligation, but nothing was happening at the Salton Sea. The state of California had not invested anything at all. So IID went back to the State Water Board and said, we've upheld our part of the deal. We're transferring water to San Diego, and yet the state of California has not lived up to its part of the deal and is not doing anything at the Salton Sea. So ultimately that led to the creation of the Salton Sea Management Program. And then the state started building some projects. And pleased to say that in May of this year, the state turned on the valves for its first large scale, or in fact, its first habitat project of any size, and flooded up some 2,000 acres of the Species Conservation Habitat Project. So from this graph, it just shows the long history of where we got to this point. And the good news is at the very bottom right, you can see that they started constructing some of the species conservation habitat, and we're finally starting to see that come to fruition. But this comes in the broader context of what's happening in the Colorado River. And probably too much on this particular graph to talk about, but the main takeaway here is that system was the Colorado River system, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, was pretty much full at the start of this century, the start of the millennium. And then the system has crashed since then. So you can see on the top left corner that we were close to 60 million acre feet of system storage in the system. We're now down to about 22 million acre feet. So 38% of capacity, and we were almost at 100% capacity. We had a nice year in 2023. You can see that bump on the right end, but we've got another dry year, and the impacts of climate change are particularly being felt because this year there was something like 90% precipitation, 90% of normal precipitation in the Colorado River Basin, but runoff was only about 50%. So they talk about runoff efficiency, but what's happening is the soils are getting drier. The season is getting, or spring is coming earlier, which means plants are germinating earlier and consuming more of that water earlier. So less of the snowpack is running off, which means there's much less water in the Colorado River system to flow down the Colorado River, which is putting a lot of pressure, as you're probably seeing in the media every day, to get the 7 basin states to agree to a deal. Bad news is they don't really seem to be coming close to a deal. And in fact, just in today's paper, they're still pointing fingers at each other, and it's looking more and more likely that it's just going to go to litigation. I guess the backdrop here is that Imperial Irrigation District and California generally have very senior rights on the Colorado River, but senior rights don't mean anything if there's not enough water to flow through Hoover Dam. And that's been part of the incentive for Imperial Irrigation District to negotiate and to actually start reducing its stake of the river, because they understand that you can litigate all you want, but if you can't get the water through the dam, you can't get the water. And that's part of the pressure to figure out some kind of solution. So that's a big policy challenge on the basin scale. On the scale of the Salton Sea, the challenge is property ownership. So this is a land ownership map, and roughly 50% of the land is federally owned, but you can see it's this classic federal checkerboard. So railroads came through, they gave away a lot of the land. About 40% of the land is owned by 35–40% of the land is owned by Imperial Irrigation District. There's some private landowners in there. The state of California on the kind of color we call the salmon color, that's the state recreation area. But there's very little state land, which makes it particularly challenging for the state to go in and build projects, because they need to work out easements, they need to work out access, and they need to address liability for these various projects that they're building. So all that takes far more time than I would expect. But there's been years and years of negotiations with the different property owners. And IID, until fairly recently, has been particularly concerned about liability, and liability in terms of once the state builds the projects, is the state going to maintain them, and who's responsible for these projects down the road. So there's been a lot of negotiating on that. The other big change in the scene recently is lithium. So this area is variously described as providing enough lithium for, I forget the exact number, 300+ million cars. So there's a lot of interest in extracting this lithium, which is not from the Salton Sea, but some 2 miles below the surface. There's a lot of very hot brines down there, which include not just lithium, but magnesium and a host of other potentially valuable metals. But there's a lot of concerns, at least from some of the community members, about what that extraction might mean. And then there's concerns as well that they're talking about building battery plants and other things, and what's that going to do for public health. And then there's conflicting land values. So this map on the left just shows different planning areas, and the purple is really where the state's focus its efforts. But this blue area near the Alamo River is also prime habitat. That's the Red Hill Bay that I was talking about earlier. So there's a huge amount of water. In fact, the Alamo River is the single largest water source for the Salton Sea. And if there's a lot of water, you can use that water to create habitat and spread the water out on the playa and limit the amount of dust. But on the right side, that's also the lithium plant area. So they're looking to expand geothermal lithium extraction efforts in that particular area. So this conflicting land use in this area that's particularly well suited for habitat. So the state at the moment is still just looking at the New River, which is where their species conservation habitat projects are built, and are postponing efforts to explore Red Hill Bay and the Alamo River Delta area until this lithium extraction or lithium builds out. Mark?
Yeah, I'm curious, does when lithium is mined, does it require any water for to assist in the mining? Or, I mean, many do, but I'm not sure about the mining of lithium. Do you know by chance?
So there's various reports on how much water lithium is going to require. So basically, they're extracting brine from a couple miles below the surface, and then some of that water in the brine it escapes essentially as steam. So they need some kind of replacement water to re-inject to maintain access to the resource. So their estimates that it could be 30,000 acre feet per year, but at full build out, it could be 150,000 acre feet per year. So at full build out, it could be a substantial amount of water. And that's what some of the concerns are from the local community. But just to keep that in context, this year, Imperial Irrigation District is foregoing use of about 220,000 acre feet of water to store that water in Lake Mead to help protect the system.
Hmm.
So there's water out there. There's a lot of water being used by agriculture in the summer months. That's usually used to irrigate forage crops. And what the farmers have done this year and last year was to accept payment in lieu of several irrigations. So they're not killing the crop, but they're not irrigating in the heat of summer, which saves a lot of water. So there's potential for reallocating that water within the Imperial Irrigation District service area as well. So yes, water, there's some development for lithium. It happens within this context of huge amounts of water use within the region as a whole. So my takeaway is it's not an insurmountable challenge, but it's certainly something to consider.
Okay, thank you.
My quick plug for a report I put out, we put out just about a month ago, was looking at the various sources of pollution in the region. And you may have seen that there's been kind of a steady stream of reports coming out of UC Riverside, out of UCLA, Loma Linda University, even Brown University, looking at the various different sources of emissions from the Salton Sea itself. So there's been talk about hydrogen sulfide, a pretty toxic gas that burps up because the Salton Sea is so ecologically productive. And then potential emissions, heavy metals, and other contaminants in the dust from the exposed lake bed. And then also recently some studies suggesting that there's biological material in the spray from the Salton Sea, which may be impacting public health as well. So in the context of all these different contaminants, I thought it'd be good to take a look, take a step back and look at what's the total air pollution burden in the region. So that's what we did, and I'll show you in the next couple slides how the Salton Sea stacks up. The link to this report is here on your screen. You can also just Google Packings Salton Sea, or you can even just Google breathing hazard Salton, and it pops up. So that's probably a faster way to get there. But the other part of this project is we put together a GIS map. So on the right side there, you can see just a quick snapshot screenshot of that image, but you can drill down into that image and it'll show you different locations of where crops are being burned, for example, or locations of crop burning versus schools, or animal feedlots versus schools, or many of the different contributors to air pollution in the region. And the idea there was to put it in a geographic context so people could see all the, or at least many of the different sources of these emissions. So this is just an inventory that the Imperial County put out. It's not the full region, but it is the southern part of the Salton Sea region. And you can see there's more than 100,000 tons of PM10, which is this, the main constituent of concern. But you can see that some 73% of that is just general fugitive windblown dust. So this next slide, and IID's consultant puts this out, and the total amount of dust coming from the Salton Sea playa itself is about 300 tons versus 70,000 tons. So that for me was an interesting figure to say, well, yes, these particular emissions from the Salton Sea may be more toxic, or even 100 times more toxic than the general dust blowing from the Western Desert. But there's a lot going on there. We need to start thinking about what some of these other sources of contaminants are in the region, and then diesel emissions as well, and how this is affecting public health. But the bigger question then is, what do we do about it? And so what the state is doing is putting out some dust suppression projects. They're putting out some straw bales and then irrigating to get native vegetation to additionally reduce the amount of dust blowing off this land. But to my mind, a more effective strategy is to really protect people where they're living. So it's a move from source control to exposure control. And often we think of the most efficient way to solve any problem is deal with the problem at its source. But the takeaway from this report is there's so many sources, and some of these are so complicated that a more efficient use of resources is to help people where they're living, where they're exposed in their schools, in their homes, in offices, to clean up the air where they're living, because there's too many different sources I would offer to control all these different sources that where they're existing, where they're emitting. It's better to capture them and treat them where people are feeling the effects. All right, so restoration efforts.
Hey, Mike, I got a question for you. So going back to that, if they were to, it sounds like you're saying that providing homes in Imperial and Coachella Valley with some type of dust, air filtration system. How would that be? I mean, some of those communities are some of the most under stressed communities in all of California. Um, how would that get paid for? Do you know? Does there any been talk about that?
So that's the next phase of my effort, is really to start looking at funding sources. So state of California has spent about $55 million. No, sorry, the state of California spent about $45 million, and Imperial Irrigation District spent about $55 million on dust suppression projects to date. So a lot of this is just building roads, because to get access to these emissive areas, they need to provide some infrastructure to get the trucks out there to lay out the straw bales, or to get the plows out there to build this. And that's a lot of money, right? $100 million. It's a lot of money, and that could supply a lot of air purifiers, for example. So I think that the big question is, if the goal is to protect public health, and there's also the habitat goal, which I'm not saying we should change any of the habitat investment, but on the public health end, it may be more effective to directly invest those monies towards air purifiers, weatherization, and you can start kind of in concentric circles, move away from the Salton Sea. So some of the poorest communities are the ones closest to the Salton Sea. So you can start with some of those communities, ensure that they have air filters, that their homes aren't super leaky, and then start moving farther away from the Salton Sea. So there's some bond money available that the state's spending on this. Imperial Irrigation District and Coachella Valley Water District both get some federal money for not taking irrigation water and leaving that Lake Mead. Some portion of that could be used as mitigation for these efforts. So there's different funding sources, and part of my next steps really is to start talking to some of the regulators to say how flexible are they, or perhaps they should be more flexible. Because if we're really looking at the efficacy of these different projects, I think it's probably a better use of funds to directly protect people, because again, there's so much going on in the region that trying to capture all those sources is, I think, infeasible.
One more question on that top of that. Obviously, there's going to be a need for education in that, because um, people have been, what you're actually saying is very different to what people have been hearing in the past. So um, it also have to include some educational outreach in that funding as well. Is that what you're thinking too,
Yes,
or
yeah,
yeah?
absolutely. And the good news is there are a lot of different programs currently operating. So there's the Salton Sea programs, but then um, the California Air Resources Board has got three different what they call AB 617 communities, which are communities that are disproportionately impacted by poor air quality. Not shown on this map, but on the GIS, this interactive map that we've got on our website, it shows where these three communities are. Two are Imperial Valley, and then one in the eastern Coachella Valley. So these AB 617 communities have some programs to install or distribute air filters um, to people's homes. Um, there's a nonprofit in the Imperial Valley, and I think they're starting to expand it to Coachella Valley, that has kind of an air quality warning system. So they've got green flags, yellow flags, red flags, right? And when air quality is bad, they're alerting people to this bad air quality, suggesting that kids shouldn't be outside playing when the air quality is very bad, for example. So there's some existing infrastructure out there to get this message across. But you're absolutely right. There's been this narrative that the Salton Sea is the cause of the problem. And part of what I wanted to do with the report was to suggest that the Salton Sea is a factor, but it doesn't appear to be the main factor. And part of that is, see if I can go back to this other slide here. So this is just comparing hospitalization rates for kids for asthma. And in here, there's a Sacramento County. You can see that the hospitalization rate is more or less tracking than in Imperial County, where the Salton Sea is. Fresno County is often even higher than that. So in fact, a lot of the Central Valley counties in California, again, these agricultural communities where there's a lot of pesticides, there's a lot of unpaved roads and dust coming from that, a lot of diesel emissions, all contributing to poor air quality and poor public health in these regions without a Salton Sea, have rates that are often higher than those immediately around the Salton Sea. So the Salton Sea is one factor, but it's not the only factor. And I think by looking more broadly, we can see that a lot of these agricultural communities, disproportionately communities of color, low-income communities are suffering. And of course, there's very little healthcare access out there. So there's a number of steps that need to be taken. And part of the idea is to help change that conversation a little bit to say, if we just fix the Salton Sea, is that going to make the problem go away? And I think by looking at other areas in California, I'm pretty confident to say we would not. So instead of focusing solely on the Salton Sea, let's figure out how we can help people where they live.
One last thing, and you can move on. I'm sorry. I'm very intrigued by this, but did your study take into account any future modeling, as if the Salton Sea becomes um, more toxic in the future? Would that change anything, or did you do any modeling for future, um, for the overall air quality, based on maybe if because the lake is getting more toxic? as we move toward the future?
So there's, I guess, I don't know if they're balancing impacts or trade-offs, because as the Salton Sea shrinks, more playa is exposed. But the Salton Sea itself, this remnant brine sink, will be farther from communities. So the
Got it.
hydrogen sulfide, for example, is something that's coming directly from the Salton Sea, but uh, it oxidizes pretty quickly, so it dissipates, particularly when windy conditions, but even just in less windy conditions, just over distance, the concentrations of hydrogen sulfide decrease. So as the shoreline recedes, it's pulling that hydrogen sulfide contributor farther and farther away from communities. At the same time that it's exposing more and more lake bed, more playa. And there's a number of constituents in the playa that may be of concern. So there's some trade-offs there. I did some in my 2013 report, some projections on how much dust could be blowing off the Salton Sea, and some of those earlier projections were way too high. So some of the work that IAD's consultant is doing now is suggesting that some 70% of the emissions come from about 20% of the 25% of the playa. And what they're really doing now, the state and the district, are focusing on building projects in those limited areas, because a lot of the areas are much less emissive. There's a salt crust that forms, for example, or other factors mean that it's less emissive. So the question is, if we find a particularly emissive area, then we should definitely work to mitigate that. But it may not make sense to use arbitrary acreages, and the state's under some orders to build 15,000 acres of dust suppression projects at the Salton Sea. But 15,000 is just a number pulled out of the air. So
yeah, I understand.
Finding those most emissive areas and then using the rest of that money to protect people where they are makes more sense. But also, we need to make sure that we're not losing sight of the habitat values of the Salton Sea. So a lot of this conversation around public health, and there's a lot of people in the region saying we need to protect public health, and habitat is less of a concern. I'm concerned about that framing, because I think we need to make sure that the birds have some place to go, because we've dried up so many of the other wetlands along the flyover.
Good point. Thanks.
All right. So this is a map or a graphic from one of the recent reports talking about where these different restoration areas are for the Salton Sea. And typically the fallback is, we call it restoration, but as I mentioned, the Salton Sea is dynamic, and what we're doing is making essentially a management decision to say, here's what we want to see at the Salton Sea, and we're going to freeze it at that particular point in time, or that set of characteristics. So some people talk about Salton Sea restoration, they mean something very different. But when the states talk about restoration or revitalization, what they're talking about is creating habitat function and then minimizing dust. So here's an image of the species conservation habitat. The blue portions have been constructed, and then as part of these additional conservation efforts by IID water conservation efforts, there was an influx of about $220 million from the federal government a couple of years ago to do these expansion projects. So the expansion projects are in red, and on the east side, that's what they filled in May of this year. So there's about 2,000 acres in this red blue that I circled in yellow. That's about 2,000 acres of wetland habitat that's been filled up. And then we've seen an almost immediate response. So there's now pelicans back at the Salton Sea. How will pelicans know that there's water back there? I don't know if there's scouts or what, that they're flying over all the time, and they suddenly see, oh, here's lower salinity water and there's some fish in there. But in any case, there's now pelicans back at the Salton Sea, which is pretty exciting. And then we got black-necked stilts and some avocets in this image as well. So that's good news. And in this other image, so the total at full build out is close to 9,000 acres. The state tells me they have money to build that. We'll see, but again, this blue is ready to go, and they're holding off on filling up the blue on the west side as they take dirt out of the existing area to build the berms and levees in the expansion areas on the west side, this on the red on the west side. But fingers crossed, that's going to happen the next couple of years, and then we'll have a pretty remarkable resource, and then they just need to start expanding that to other areas of the Salton Sea. There's also, in terms of preserving these emergent wetlands, there's this large wetland near Bombay Beach, and in the very bottom left corner of this image, you can see that's actually maybe it's a hamlet of Bombay Beach. There's a little community there, but then a little to the southeast of Bombay Beach is this wetland. And this particular wetland is less about drainage, about agricultural drainage, but it's drain water mainly from the Coachella Canal and then some hot springs up in the area. And that water used to flow directly into the Salton Sea, but as the Salton Sea receded, there were a bunch of barnacle bars that essentially held that water back. In response, there was a lot of vegetation. I think it's about 800 acres of vegetation showed up in that region. And what they're trying to do is make that more permanent. And then within that, you've got endangered Yuma clapper rails, ridgeway rails now, inhabiting that wetland. So there's a bunch of these wetlands, and the idea is that this is going to become a model for preserving some of these other wetlands that have emerged around the Salton Sea. And then these are just a couple quick slides of what the surface roughening or the dust suppression efforts are to protect air quality. And there's a bunch of these projects the state has built and then IID has built. And many of these were temporary projects. So they spent money to minimize dust emissions while they're building the habitat project. So particularly, you can see in this image on the lower left, Vale Drain, River West, that's species conservation habitat. So they spent money to do these surface roughening projects in anticipation of covering it up again later with the habitat projects. And that's some of these same projects are occurring in other parts of the Salton Sea. So here's a different image near Salton City on the west shore of the Salton Sea. So these are straw bales. And the idea here is to break up the wind and provide some protection for young plants as they're germinating. And then once the plants become established, they'll overgrow the straw bales. But it's a chance to get plants up there and prevent dust from blowing off this exposed lake bed. The other challenge in the region is the state is very much focused on building habitat and building dust suppression, but has not really integrated community priorities into this. So some of the local groups, Alianza, for example, has put out some proposals to better integrate these community needs into that. The state hired Better World Group to put out a report and then did its own assessment. But to date, there's been very little effort to build trails into these habitat projects, for example, to provide public access so people can actually get out there and experience the wildlife out there. And incidentally, help educate the community to what's going on so the community understands that things are actually happening at the Salton Sea and appreciates it and can actually benefit from it. So much more work needs to be done on the public access end. And these are just some of the different objectives that have been identified by community members. One big thing that's completely missing from the state effort is any kind of vision. So Pacific Institute works with a couple other groups, Sierra Club, Joan Taylor, many of you probably know, and then Audubon, California, and then Alianza, Los Amigos de la Comunidad, and Leadership Council. And we help craft this vision for what could be happening at the Salton Sea. And the idea is really to help move the state away from its focus on just building habitat and dust suppression acreage towards some broader vision of what the Salton Sea could be. And our thought is that by having a broader vision, you can try to move forward rather than just saying, oh, we built 2,000 acres this year, we're going to build 2,500 acres next year, without putting that in the broader context of what could occur. So the future, this is where things get a little sketchy. Joe?
You're on mute, Joe.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful, informative session. I'd like to take on the vision question a little bit. We know the Colorado River Basin is desertifying. We have public health issues. We have issues that you've been talking about for other species. Articles I've read from residents of the Salton Sea area say they're so tired of attending meetings and hearing people talk and then nothing happening. So, how about a vision that goes something like this? Why not get behind a pipeline from the Sea of Cortez to the Salton Sea with massive solar arrays over the pipeline, including over the pipeline to desalinate the water. The water could be used not just to feed the Salton Sea, but also for projects in agriculture nearby. And then in the desert, where there's desert now, where you've got these plants you were just showing to block wind, why don't we plan to build and start building a forest? Literally, a multi-species forest that would, over time, how would I say, re-energize, re-enable the desert to be not just desert, and create out of this project, a solution for the Salton Sea, adding more water, having more water. We know we need more water. We're in this drying period from our climate change stresses and the like. And I think a project like that would have enormous benefits over time and addressing the Salton Sea and other issues that are with us today. What are your thoughts?
Fortunately, well, I looked at this very question because this has come up. In fact, George Brown was suggesting something along these lines 30 years ago. And there's, I guess, a couple challenges with a pipeline. To my mind, the biggest single challenge is the amount of time it would take to actually get to a solution. So San Diego County Water Authority, 7 years ago, proposed kind of an intertie from the end of the All-American Canal into the San Diego system to bring water directly from the Colorado River to San Diego service area and bypassing that, because Metropolitan charges, or was charging, a huge amount of money. I think it was on the order of $400+ an acre foot just to move the water from the Colorado River into San Diego's service area. So they thought, let's just build a pipeline to short circuit that. We can do the conveyance ourselves. But San Diego estimated that a pipeline across the mountains would take 30 years, mainly for permitting. Because California, as you know, the permitting environment, although we'll see what happens with CEQA, but the permitting environment is challenging. And the additional challenge from the Gulf of California is that it's through Mexico. So relations between the United States and Mexico are perhaps not their best these days. There's different kinds of pipelines. Some people say we should build a pipeline in each direction because either you put in a lot of new water and then take the salt out of the existing Salton Sea, or you pump salty water from the Salton Sea back into the Gulf of California or some other place, because there's something like 450 million tons of salt in the Salton Sea right now. And if you just pour distilled water into the Salton Sea, you might, and you raise the volume back up another 50%, you're still only going to reduce the salinity of the Salton Sea by a third or so, which is still roughly 50% or 70% saltier than the ocean. So you've got to make this plan work. You need to get salt out of the Salton Sea, and to do that, you have to build another canal And again, it would be on the order of 2 all-American canals. So a huge amount of water moving in both directions just to stabilize the Salton Sea. But to my mind, the biggest challenge is time. And I mean, people have been talking about this for literally decades. And I think somebody at a meeting earlier today was saying Elon Musk had an idea to pump water through the mountains from Carlsbad. But until Elon starts throwing some money at the problem, uh, we're talking 30, $50 billion. And I guess I'm struggling to see how we're going to afford that. So time,
Well, I
money.
mean, look, 30 years ago, if we'd started 30 years ago, we'd be there now.
Yeah,
And
yes.
what we're doing, what the solutions you've been talking about for people seem to me to be band-aids. You know, having a joyous life with having to wear masks, you know, frequently, and and not be outdoors. Uh, I don't see how that wins any prizes, over long term. We're kind of condemning the people living there to a not very pleasant existence by not, uh, you know, taking this vision or some other one and really addressing the problem. And if we integrate the solution with the need for water, I mean, look at the challenges of the volume of water on the Colorado River right now. There's just almost no doubt with climate change that we need substantially more water, and we can plug that into this project, into this equation, and feed water to San Diego County as well as agriculture. And you know anyway, I don't think, I mean, I understand the health issues and the need to make partial solutions, but they're really not good long-term solutions. We're just, in a sense, um, avoiding the problem.
Um, yeah, I mean, part of me in the report is completely agreeing with you. Um, and had we started focusing on climate change 30 years ago, uh, the runoff from the Colorado River would not have decreased as rapidly. And where the world's going to be in 30 years, or even, well, frankly, 2 years, has me considerably nervous. But I think in the short term, and what I'm really trying to focus on is getting some habitat projects in the ground to provide um, places for the birds to go, and then protect public health. Uh, I for many years people have been talking about this pipeline, um, but I haven't seen it come to fruition. So, I think we share the general idea of protecting people and species in the region, but I'm concerned about the amount of time it takes to get there.
Well,
David?
those are certainly valid concerns. Let me just make one more point then. Johann Rockstrom, in a TED Talk last fall, said that by 2050, we will lose something like 18% of global GDP on the climate trajectory we're on, which is like $38 trillion a year globally. 18% of global GDP by that time. And the Society and Institute of Actuaries, the Faculty of Actuaries in Europe, says that there's a 50% chance by 2070 to 2090 that we will lose 50% of global GDP to environmental catastrophe, and that the human population will be around 4 billion, not 8 billion. Uh, you know, we are headed to incredible crisis, and I don't think band-aids are the way to address the challenge. I mean, band-aids are fine. Everything you said makes sense, except, as you said a moment ago, it doesn't have the vision with it to make real transformations that we need.
All right, thanks. David?
Um, Thank you. I have enjoyed your talk a lot. Am, I just want to remind people that the Salton Sea is in a depression and it's historically desert. It's like Death Valley. It was not a a place for all kinds of water resources. I think what we have moving forward, you see all the restoration efforts are sort of along the edge of the Salton Sea, leaving the Salton Sea in the middle. And I don't think there's a lot of effort to address that part of the Salton Sea. In fact, one of the southern restoration projects has a large pump station that's going to bring water from the Salton Sea into the restoration project. So it's sort of a situation where the Salton Sea is going to be set up as a not necessarily a tool for the future, but it's going to be used. The Salton Sea is going to be used, and I think in a lot of ways the question becomes, if we can really improve the edges and prevent the dust from picking up material from the edge, and if we can provide more habitat, the bird populations will come back. But I've already seen thousands of cormorants leave the Salton Sea because the fish are too big or the fish are no longer there. So it's sort of the whole situation, it's a whole dynamic, but I think trying to make it into a lake that had the levels that used to have is barking up the wrong tree. So I guess what would that was a lot of speaking. Is there a response to that one? Sorry.
Well, so in some ways, you're exactly right. So in the 20s, President Hubert Hoover, I think, designated the Salton Sea as an agricultural sump. So for basically 100 years, the Salton Sea has been designated a place for the runoff from particularly Imperial Valley, as well as Mexicali Valley and Coachella Valley. So all that fertilizer, there's limited regulations on water quality flowing into the Salton Sea. In the future, we're not really sure what the long-term plan is from the state of California. California is in some ways kicking the can down to the Army Corps of Engineers, which is in a multi-year process of developing another study for a long-range plan for the Salton Sea. And when that comes out, might be 4 or 5 years from now. But a lot of the current concepts are exactly what you described. Capturing some of the water, the better quality water that flows into the Salton Sea, creating habitat and suppressing dust around the edges, and then allowing this brine sink to continue to shrink, but to be a receptacle, particularly for the salt, and then for some of the other contaminants that flow into the Salton Sea. Because as I mentioned, there's 450 million tons of salt. I did some calculation a while back that you could create a pillar of salt, I forget how many hundreds of miles high, just from that salt. So to try to dispose that salt, to pick that salt up, move it and dispose it somewhere else would be particularly expensive. So leaving it essentially in place provides essentially a built-in repository for the salts and some of the other contaminants in the Salton Sea. And then you have this ring of high quality habitat around it. And that can be recreational amenity, quality habitat for migratory birds. We're already starting to see some of the fish come back to this new habitat that the state built. So it's a very different Salton Sea than what people are used to, and certainly what the Salton Sea was in its heyday. But in some ways, it may be a more resilient Salton Sea because it's adapted to the amount of water flowing into it. which though it may be much less, still could be on the order of 500,000 acre feet of water per year, which is a lot of water, which could translate into a lot of habitat. Stefan, or I'm sorry for pronouncing your name wrong.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. That's right. So just to summarize, so you mentioned the inflow went down from roughly 1.1 million acre feet to what, like 760,000 acre feet, and the volume went down from roughly 7 million acre feet to 4. I have a two-part question. Like, are you confident that we're able to stabilize the current level in the near future? And second question, like all these restoration efforts, are they aligned with a future where the level could drop even further and the volume of available water?
So answer your first question. Go back a slide here. So this is just future projections for Colorado River runoff. And we're likely to see the storage in the system continue to drop, which has put additional pressure on Imperial Irrigation District to maintain its at least, or perhaps I should say at most, its current consumption of water, likely less, which means that the Salton Sea is going to continue to drop. Some earlier projections had the Salton Sea exposing about 100 square miles of lake bed. We've got 65 or so square miles, so it could be another 35 square miles, another 50% additional exposure. But I'm reluctant to predict the future and to how far the lake's really going to drop, because first off, we don't know what's going to happen with the Colorado River negotiations. Current rules expire at the end of next year. The states, as I showed in an earlier slide, are very far apart from coming to any kind of agreement. It's looking more and more likely to be litigation between the states, which is going to go to the Supreme Court. Where that goes may not be beneficial for California, given the increasing partisanship of the Supreme Court, which could mean even less water flowing to the Salton Sea. But the upside is if there's 900,000 acre feet or so of water flowing into the Salton Sea, even if it drops to say 500,000 acre feet, 500,000 acre feet of water is a staggering amount of water, right? It's just, it's more water than San Diego County uses in a year. It's not going to be very good quality water, but it's a lot of water. And with that water, I contend you could still create 50,000 acres of habitat or more, particularly as that water, you cascade that water via gravity from habitat cell to habitat cell, increasing the salinity, which means you get greater diversity of species. So you can create a lot of habitat. And then at the same time, there's less playa exposed, because you can kind of create a mosaic where you get spaces of habitat and then playa, that the wind fetch is interrupted between the two. So completely different than what the Salton Sea looks like now. But to my mind, it's a very different sea, but it's still a very ecologically productive sea, and potentially a place people still want to go to recreate. You could have areas in different spots where recreation is a key feature. So I think that's something that's not the big vision, but I think it's a smaller, more achievable vision.
Understood. Thank you. Just to follow up, are you saying that the runoff that is flowing into the Salton Sea, that is water that we can capture and distribute to the different habitat or different restoration projects?
Yeah, exactly. So what's happening with the State Species Conservation Habitat Project, essentially is they built a dam across the new river, and they have some sediment ponds, and they capture that, basically it's agricultural drainage water, and then spread it out across these different habitats. So that's exactly what they're doing. And the idea with some of these emergent wetlands is they've already formed, and the idea is to help preserve those existing features.
Thank you.
Yeah, what's this?
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. This has been super informative. Thank you for all the many years of work you've done in the community and on these issues. You mentioned the needs of the community and how in the future they need to be at the table. They haven't really, one of the challenges is that they haven't really been at the table, speaking with the state and other actors there early on. Hopefully that'll be changing. I just wanted to, I'm making a plug here. It's more of a statement. I wanted to let folks know that I put a link in the chat box. That's a letter of support from us as individuals that shows that we're supportive of having that those communities in the northern part of, in this case, in the northern part of the Salton Sea, create their own multi-benefit trails around the Salton Sea. It's one small step towards making sure that they're engaged and they're getting benefit from um, the potential solutions, and basically, shows that we're listening to them. Hopefully during those days that are good, they can walk out and as you say, Michael, really benefit and recreate in these beautiful places that still exist around the Salton Sea. Again, thank you for all your work, Michael.
Thanks.
We'll make sure we get it shared out too there, Moises. Appreciate it.
Hello, this is Ben Everett. Am I on?
You are, Ben.
I'm interested in this subject because the Utahns are looking at much the same problem with the Great Salt Lake, which has been shrinking lately. And I want to remind you that the Great Salt Lake is a very productive ecosystem on its own, even though it's, I think, 30,000 milligrams per liter, 10 times as salty as the ocean anyway. But it's part of a larger ecosystem, and it's got wetlands around it. And the wetlands expand as the lake shrinks, and then the wetlands retreat as the lake rises. And this balancing act has been going on for centuries. But the wetlands surrounding the lake with its brine flies and brine shrimp is part of the whole package. And I think you're on the right track by building wetlands around the shore of the Salton Sea as it shrinks. That's the way to go. And I wouldn't worry so much about the Salton Sea getting saltier. It can take a little bit more. As it shrinks, the dust will come off the exposed shoreline to a certain extent, but as Mark said, I think it's a small part of the whole package. Salt Lake has had dust storms and salt storms as long as I can remember. Salt Lake City. And people put up with it. But I appreciate the whole discussion. This has been very interesting.
Great, thanks. Yeah, there's certainly a lot of similarities between Great Salt Lake and Salton Sea, and in fact, some of the same birds travel between the two. There's white pelicans, Wilson's phalaropes, migrating between these two bodies. The big difference, as you mentioned, Salt Lake City is downwind of Great Salt Lake, and that's where the legislature sits, and they paid a lot more attention. If the Salton Sea were upwind of Los Angeles or Sacramento, I suspect that we'd be having a conversation.
Yep.
So I just have a couple more slides. Let me blow through these. So I've just got a slide on some further reading. We have a website that, if you just go to Pacific Institute Salton Sea, there's also a current information website, which I've put together that just shows the current elevation of the Salton Sea, the amount of land exposed, the amount of wetlands, differences between today's date and this date in 2003, the year the QSA was signed, just as kind of a reference or baseline. This top one, the Salton Sea saltons.ca.gov is the state's Salton Sea website. So there's some information there. They, I wouldn't say update it regularly, but periodically they put some updates. And in fact, if you go to that website and fidget around a little bit, you'll find there's a community meeting next Thursday. I think it's at 10 a.m. Next or a week from today. There's a link on the saltsea.ca.gov website. If you go to the community page, there's a public meeting to learn more about, particularly about what the state's doing. And then just a host of other websites here. And then this bottom one, this Zotero. So over the past couple of years, I put together a bibliography of Salton Sea references. There's now more than 1,000 items in there. Talk a bunch of articles on different aspects of the Salton Sea, from birds to geothermal to lithium to public health and air quality. So I've made it it's a membership website. Anybody can go to it, look through, you can scroll through it. But if you want to go in there and add things, you need to become a member, and I'm happy to make any of you guys members. I just didn't want random people messing with it. But it's a resource out there. I encourage people who are interested, particularly in the scientific literature, to scroll through that. And then my closer here is just this quote from Congressman George Brown, talking about political will at the Salton Sea. But to me, it's a little ironic because I stole this slide from a presentation that was given more than 20 years ago. And I think the congressman made the quote 10, 15 years before that. So there's been a lot of ebb and flow in the Salton Sea, whether you want to call them cycles or pendulums or what. So currently we're seeing some political will, or at least some focus on the Salton Sea. Just Saturday, there was some additional monies in the final budget that the governor just signed to stand up a new governance organization, the Salton Sea Conservancy. This is finally coming into place. So that's really encouraging news. There's going to be some dedicated body that only is working on the Salton Sea. So we're seeing some progress, some momentum. Just caveating this, that I've had hope before. So that's what I got. I'm happy to take other questions, or see if I've gone long, but I'm here.
Well, all I want to say, Mike, is what a fantastic sessions. I really want to thank you for doing this. And I also want to thank everyone for showing up with curiosity and purpose to really drive some very interesting questions out there. I feel, I know that many people have been working this a lot longer than we have, but than I have, and what all of us have, but there is a lot of momentum out there. I think our voices do make a difference. A healthier Salton Sea and the habitat around it means a healthier family, stronger local economies, protected wildlife, and cleaner air for our kids and our grandkids. So we are going to record all this, and anybody who is registered, we will send this recording to you after we're done, so you can refer back to this. And if it jogs your memory, Michael has put his email in the so you can ask him directly. So I see a couple people with their hands up. Ron.
I just want to give a shout out to Richard Fuel, who's on the call. He about a year ago at the open house said, "Let's bring back the Sierra Talk." So Richard, it's finally happening. So thank you.
With that, I do want to make an announcement that our next Sierra Talk is actually going to be on Wednesday, October 30th at 6 p.m. Richard, you're on, and the topic is going to be Colorado River Management and its effects on Southern California. This one is going to be a hybrid, virtual on Zoom and in person, and it'll be at our offices at 4241 Jutland Drive, Suite 303. So, does anybody else got any questions before we sign off? Again, I want to thank Michael. You're the bomb. This started at a bar in San Diego where we decided we'd do this, and it's always good when you can come up with something over a cocktail and move forward with doing this in person. So I'm sending much gratitude to you, my friend, and I look forward to working with you some more. And I'd love to do this more because I know that the Pacific Institute has got lots of topics that we can cover, and we're really trying to focus on water. And the next one we're really wanting to look at beyond the Colorado River is actually nature's reservoirs and how the impact of snow is being drives our economies as well. So that's something we're interested as well. So Michael, I'd be interested to any help you can give me on that one. So yeah, but all right. So thank you very much for your evening. I appreciate it. Everybody have a great night, and thanks again. Take care.
Great. Thanks all. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Bye-bye.